Well, it's good to be back. Appreciate the opportunity. It's always exciting to be invited once, and then it's always encouraging to be invited twice. It is a little anxiety building to know that your boss is sitting in the audience, and so I'm gonna have to rethink my sermon here, make sure no shenanigans or anything. No, it's just great to be here. And actually, the last time I was here, I was supposed to come the following week, but we had some really bad weather. And so the sermon I wanted to preach then, which was on the Lord's Prayer, is what we're going to emphasize today. So when I was here last time, we talked about the creation story, right? We talked about Genesis 1 to 3, and we made a compare and contrast to the story that the Babylonians told, and just use that to show you the main points in the intensity and the importance that the creation story was making. Mainly, that God had always existed, that this particular God had always existed, and compared to the other gods that kind of self-spawned, or one God created the other and so forth, but that the God of Israel in reality is the God of humanity. And that God has always existed, and God is a powerful God whose very presence was enough to take this chaotic reality into a world of purpose and creation and harmony and beauty and humanity. And then the second point, that God created humanity, not just the royal family, which was what creation stories, competing creation stories of the day would emphasize, is that the royal families were in the images of their gods. But that in Genesis, all of humanity, men and women, are in the image of God. And so that was elevating humanity, elevating all of humanity. And because of that, they were to bear that image and to together collaborate with each other, representing the presence of God, and be agents of transformation into a world still of chaos. Okay. So that's just to remind you where we've been. So then we come to Jesus. And the point we also made is that Jesus is the fulfillment of all that. Jesus, in Matthew's account, in chapter 1, where it talks about verse 1, the genealogy of Jesus, then I think you get to verse 17 or 18, it talks about the birth of Jesus. Those both words, in English translated genealogy and in English translated birth, in Greek are the word Genesis. So if you're an ancient Jew reading Matthew's account, who was a Jew, talking about their Jewish backstory, and you get at the very beginning there that Matthew is saying that Jesus is connected to the story of Genesis. Where do you think Matthew wants you to go? He wants you to realize that what Jesus is Genesis redone. He's like the new beginning of humanity. He is humanity done right as we were intended to be. So in Jesus, we have not just the fulfillment of the idea of salvation, we have in Jesus the fulfillment of what it means to be a humanity that completely bears the image of God, that interacts relationally because of the presence of God, and is gathering unto himself a community that is going to live as agents of betterment and transformation in a world still of chaos. And that's the story of Jesus. Okay. So then Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount, what we call the Sermon on the Mount, at the end of chapter 4, before he begins in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, you read there that Jesus is gathering crowds and that he's going to articulate the good news of the kingdom. And if you read who's there, we have the broken, the distraught, the ignored, the poor, the people that in that society had no impact, no influence, no voice. Nobody cared what they thought. They weren't voting for anything. Nobody cared. But they're coming to Jesus, and Jesus is going to speak to them. And he begins in Matthew 5 with the list of blessings, which is a weird list. A weird list. It's an upside down list. It's things that Jesus is saying, if God is with you, here's what your life should look like. Now, the positive things is, blessed are those that mourn because they will be comforted. Like the comforting part is good, and then all the second halves of the sentences. But what he starts with, talking about poverty of spirit, talking about those that are suffering, being persecuted, more like things that they all were experiencing, but not thinking of positive. And so Jesus is reframing that God is in the brokenness of their lives and still in the brokenness of ours, right? And then you get a little further into Matthew 5. Jesus was often criticized by the religious leaders that somehow he was actually breaking the law, that he was anti-Israel, that he was like heretic and he was blasphemous. And Jesus says, I didn't come to replace those things. I actually came to fulfill them. And that's an important distinction, because what Jesus is saying, not only is he the fulfillment of what it means to be human, he is the kind of human that the law of Moses was trying to create into Israel. And that he came to live and gather unto himself a version of humanity that was the kind of people that Israel was supposed to be because of the law. And so Jesus didn't come to replace it. He came to make it possible to be the version of humanity that we need to be. Not through legislation, but through his life, his mission, his teachings. Then we get to Matthew chapter 6, and there's a lot of cool things there. Matthew is comparing the law. You have heard it say, and then he adds, but I tell you, and he does this 6 different times. You have heard it say, do not commit adultery, which we're still not supposed to do. But I tell you, if you lust, like he's taking what the law was trying to say and going to the heart of what the law was trying to transform. And that he says legislation is limited in that, but my presence, God, the Spirit, that can be achieved. If we start with the heart and with the mind, it actually comes out into the behaviors we're supposed to do. You have to start with the heart. You have to start with the mind. And Jesus has this crowd, and the disciples come to him, and they're like, Jesus, teach us how to pray. Now, this does not mean that they did never pray. Quite the opposite. Israel, all the way back to Moses, with what was known as the Shema in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. They prayed that 3 times a day. Okay? And then they also chanted and prayed like different psalms and different occasions. So they had a very repetitive, ritualistic, but consistent prayer. Like calling to God, realizing that God is great, realizing that God is one, realizing the need to be a community that reflects the presence of God. Now, if they succeeded, depends, the moment in time, but they were very dedicated to the act of prayer. So when they come to Jesus, they're not saying, hey, we've never prayed before. What is this thing? Tell us something. What they're saying to Jesus is that by now they had started to witness Jesus, surely who grew up doing this as well, but was also doing more. He was not just repeating these sentences. He was living ways that contrasted with the religious leaders. He was claiming authority that contrasted with the religious leaders. He was doing things, interacting with people groups that was like a no-no in that society. And so they come to Jesus and they're like, Jesus, teach us how you understand the relationship between connecting with God. In other words, prayer. What's your version of, your understanding of it, your mindset of it, your heart? How are you doing this? because you're doing so much more. So then Jesus turns to them and gives a little, first kind of a framework. Two things you got to be different than. One is the hypocrites. And what about that? The hypocrites are the religious leaders of Israel, or at least some of them, that would go in very public places and would recite the Shema and some other things, but to do so in very grandiose ways to be seen, to get attention, for people to be like, ooh, look how religious they must be. And Jesus says, instead of that, he then gives this opposite contrast. I want you to go like as if you're going to hide into your closet, and there you shut the door, and like the lights off in a little corner, you pray to God. And God's going to realize that you're praying because of what prayer is supposed to be about, an intimate connection and relationship with God. And because of that motivation, God is going to listen. Because here's what the hypocrites are getting. Only the attention by the passerby. That's all they're getting out of that prayer. But if you pray with the right purpose, God's going to listen. Now, he's not prescribing you can only play in a closet. He's contrasting. He's giving two extremes to make a point. Do not be for show. You just be about this intimate connection with God. Okay? Number two, do not be like the pagans. These are followers of other gods, right? And what do? They go to their temples and they have their priests or intercessors or whatever, and they try by a lot of words and a lot of show and a lot of repetition and a lot of babbling, they're trying to wake up their gods, get their gods to pay attention. Because, gods are a pretty big deal. They're kind of famous. And why are they going to listen to you? Well, we got to stir them up and wake them up and, play a lot of things and get them to really listen and let's yell loud. And Jesus is like, you don't need to do that at all. Because this God, he knows you. He cares. He listens. You don't have to spend 90% of your prayer getting him to even just listen. You can just go right to it because he cares. Okay, so that's this framework. All right, then he gets to what's been known over the centuries as the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation and deliver us from the evil one. If you're reading King James or New King James or any version of that, for yours is the kingdom, the power, forever and ever. Amen. All right. Few things. Let's just walk through it with the rest of our time here. First, he starts it with our Father. Israel, the priests, the teachers of the law, the rabbis, they did not have the habit of calling God a father, as in an intimate, you're my father. Now, there's some versions of it, they would think of Israel's father, because some language when God was trying to get Israel free from Egypt way back about 1,500 years or so before Jesus, God says to Pharaoh through Moses, you're trying to kill my firstborn, so that's what's going to come to Egypt. Okay, because of that, they thought of God as the father of a nation, of a people group. But Jesus thinks of God in a more intimate, relational way. He calls God my Father. And that just really stirred some religious leaders. It really made them angry because they thought Jesus was blasphemous. What you and I take for granted, Jesus was deeply criticized for it. And not only did he, and you're like, of course, we understand Jesus is God in the flesh, the Son of God. He can call God his Father. But Jesus doesn't just call God his Father. He then invites his disciples. This is how you pray. You think of God as your Father. as a God who cares, who loves you, who treats you like his beloved child. And people were like, is that allowed? Can we pray? Can we say that? Isn't that blasphemous? And then he said, our Father who is in heaven. Okay. In English, that's complicated because when we think of the word heaven, we think of a place we are going to eventually be in, a place of eternity where we're going maybe to, float up there, get wings, and maybe there'll be plump little babies playing harp that will welcome into the presence of God. Okay, that's not what's being said here. In Genesis 1, when it says God created the heavens and the earth, he was not yet talking about the sky or the atmosphere where birds hang out. And he wasn't yet talking about that clump of rock because that comes later in the days. What he was talking about is like two realms, two realities, the spiritual realm and the physical realm. So when you think of the heavens or heaven here, he's talking about God who lives in the spiritual world. And he's not just a distant God, because the ancients thought that the gods lived above somewhere, far from us, Mount Olympus and wherever. He's saying here, this God, yes, is a God who is in the spiritual realm, but he is a God who is your father, like a personal, connected, loving father. And he lives in the spiritual realm, but he doesn't just hang out far above. Because then he says, hallowed be your name. The ancient world was a world of gods. Everybody had a god, right? The village god, the family god, the god of the city, the god of the empire, the god of the royal family, the god of, their favorite soccer team. Like everybody had a god. And so in a world of multiple gods, what's one more? And people would just kind of pick and choose. Some of them were like out of ethnicity, this is the God of this ethnicity, so here I am. Oh, our God over here is stronger, so I'm going to pray to that God. Well, I'm just going to pray to half a dozen gods just in case. In a world of that kind of approach, he wants his disciples to include in their worldview, which is what this prayer is summarizing, the fact that this God is set apart. That's what it means, uniquely set apart. It's like the idea of holy. He is different. He is set apart. And when we don't live with that consistent recognition, we act in ways that not only ignore the fact that he's set apart, it actually shames the fact that this God is meant to set apart. It corrupts that reality. And what Jesus isn't pulling this out of nothing. Jesus is using imagery here that deeply connects with the backstory. For example, the idea of hallowed be your name. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 22. Ezekiel 36. So here's Israel's been in a horrible mess. The Babylonians are coming to destroy things. The north has been destroyed by the Assyrians. The Babylonians are coming and eventually will destroy the north. The north's been destroyed by the Assyrians. The Babylonians are going to come, destroy the south, which includes Jerusalem. So here's Ezekiel, and then there's Jeremiah and others that are trying to save that destruction from happening. But they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't listen. This is about 600 years before Jesus. They wouldn't listen. And then God, through Ezekiel, wants this message to be cleared. Verse 22. Here's why this suffering is going to come on Israel. Therefore, say to the Israelites, this is what the sovereign Lord says. It is not for your sake, people of Israel, that I'm going to do these things, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations where you have gone. I will show the holiness of my great name, which you have profaned among the nations, the name you have profaned among them. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the sovereign Lord, when I am proved holy before their eyes. Then verse 24, this is really cool, and listen to the imagery of God, Jesus, Spirit, baptism. For I will take out of the nations, and then I will gather you from all of those countries and bring you back to me, to my own land. I will wash you with water, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all the impurities and from your idols. I will give you a new heart, and I will put in you a new spirit. I will remove from you the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I will pour out my spirit on you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep all my laws. That's basically what Jesus is saying in chapter 6. There was the purpose of the law. You struggled with that. Your hearts were hardened. But let me tell you, I am here to fulfill what God said through Ezekiel when he said to a very chaotic nation of Israel 600 years before Jesus, that once again was in the same mess. Here destroyed by the Babylonians, here about to destroy by the Romans. God is saying through Ezekiel, I'm going to do something that's going to change that reality. And it's going to have to do with washing. It's going to have to do with my spirit. And then I'm going to be able to put my laws in your heart. Not just through legislation, in your heart. And Jesus comes because the problem with Israel, ancient Israel, and the problem with humanity at large, we've lived in ways that have dishonored the fact that we are carrying the image of God. There are other people out there, when they hear the word, and I'll just make the jump here, Christian, they twitch because to them that has been a horrible experience. And there are people that are not interested in Christ because of people who call themselves Christians. Now, it's not a new problem. It's not a new problem. And Jesus wants his followers to remember that God's name is to be set apart. And consequently, live in a way that does not profane the name of God. To not profane the name of God. So back to the prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So once again, as you rule in the spiritual world, may you rule and your will be done in this reality. Here, in this reality. Now, to pray that is intense because he uses the word kingdom, which in that particular historical moment, kingdoms were at odds with each other. There's a layer of it, but at least Rome and Israel were at odds with each other. Israel was being militarily occupied by Rome, and war was brewing. The zealots were trying to free Israel by force. About 40 years after Jesus, wars is going to completely break out. The Romans are going to destroy Jerusalem, burn the temple, hasn't been rebuilt to this day. In that setting, Jesus says, pray to God, may your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. To use the language, your kingdom come, was going to get you in trouble. It was going to get the spies of Rome to pay attention to you. This is language of like anti-empire. And it was going to get them, and it got Jesus in trouble with the Romans. What Jesus is praying, not a military occupation, not even a military liberation. What Jesus is praying is, we need the kingdom of God to break through the kingdom of darkness. And you know where that starts? In the hearts of those that follow Jesus. So if you dare pray this, I want you to know that this means your life's going to have to change. That there's going to be some transformation that needs to happen. There's going to be like some stirrings that things need to be different in your life. So that then we can gather around the presence of Jesus, just like God said it through Ezekiel, and we can then be transformed so we can then be transformative into the world around us. So your kingdom come doesn't just mean I'm going to sit and warm the pew and God do something in the political mess we're in. Also a good prayer, but you're praying for transformation in your heart and in your life. Give us today the daily bread. Jesus isn't just saying pray so you have something to eat every day. Jesus here, out of time, we won't go there, but in Deuteronomy 8, this is when Israel had been freed from Egypt. They're out in the wilderness. They do not trust God. And for 40 years on a daily basis, they're going to be reminded to trust God. And how was that? Because God was going to give daily bread, right, from the heavens. And they had to trust God that you get enough for today. But what about tomorrow? Some would go and gather more. The next day it was all rotten because they're not trusting God. So here it's not just pray that you have a good meal tomorrow or today. It is pray that you on a daily basis, God gives you an opportunity to trust on God, to trust in God. So if you want to look there, Deuteronomy 8, the whole story. Forgive our debts as we also forgive our debtors. Listen carefully. You cannot have the good news of the kingdom, which in essence is about mending broken relationships with self, with others, with God, all through Jesus. You cannot have that happen. It will not happen if God doesn't start with forgiveness towards us. And then we will never be the kind of gathered humanity, right? The church that is being transformed so we can then be transformative if we are not then about forgiving each other. If you do not have forgiveness, it will not go forward. There's no other version of it. It has to be through forgiveness. It cannot be through justice because then we all going to spend a time in eternity somewhere besides heaven. It has to be through forgiveness. And so Jesus includes that as the heart of it. Forgive others because you've been forgiven. Then a little after the prayer here, he's going to say, oh yeah, by the way, and if you don't, you will not be forgiven as well. Forgiveness is the essence of this. Jesus says this in Matthew 5, blessed are those who show mercy, because mercy will be shown to them. And then finally he concludes with, and lead us not into, yours probably says temptations, not a good word. It's testing. Temptation implies God manipulating you to do evil. James goes on in details, but like God does not. He's not tempted. He won't tempt you. The word here is testing. Lead us not into a test, and keep us or deliver us from evil or the evil one. Let's read real quick. Deuteronomy chapter 8, just verse 2. This is back to the whole thing of the bread there, but this fits with this as well. Verse 1 and 2. Be careful. Follow every command I'm giving you, so that you may live and increase and may enter the promised land as the Lord had promised. Okay, but then verse 2. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way into the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you, to test what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commandments. What Jesus is asking here and wants us to ask is, God, if possible, can't you just look into our hearts and not put us in a whole lot of tests? I teach at OC. I have never had a student come to me at the final exam and be like, I would like to thank you for creating this opportunity for me to show you how much I've learned this semester. Ever. When I give my kids chores, I have never had my 16-year-old son come to me and be like, Father, thank you for the opportunity to clean my room, as it has allowed me to show you how much I have grown as a 16-year-old in my maturity. ever. Because we don't like tests. We rather not have to be tested. Now, we will be tested, but God is saying, Jesus here is saying, pray that God minimize those tests. Here's why. Because evil also comes along and then tempts you through the test. I don't give final exams at OC so that people will be tempted to cheat. That's not the purpose of it. But what does evil do with the test? It also creates an opportunity for you to cheat. What did evil do with Israel? It had Israel not trust in God, which actually then led to 40 years of reminding. And even through those 40 years, like I said, often they would gather for 2 days where they weren't supposed to. So God wasn't trying to get them to do evil. God was trying to get them to realize, here's what's in your heart. I know what's in your heart. Here's how you're going to know what's in your heart. So let's try to trust God instead so we don't have to be tested so we can find out the brokenness that's in our hearts. Part of that is what we're supposed to do during the Lord's Supper. When Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 11, he says, do this in remembrance of Jesus. And he says, when you do this, you're to take the cup, take the fruit, take the cup, take the bread, and you are to analyze yourself. Because some were not doing this, he says, and that's why some of you are sick and fallen asleep, not in the sermon, I think, like at least spiritually dying, maybe physically as well, but spiritually for sure. Because if we don't take the time to test ourselves, analyze ourselves, judge ourselves, not others, ourselves, when we take of the Lord's Supper, we remember what Jesus did, and then we test ourselves. Did I live a life this week that reflected forgiveness? Did I live a life this week that reflected sacrifice? Did I live a life this week that reflected the love of God? And if not, correct. And if you do that self-testing, God will not have to test you. Does this make sense? That's what Paul is saying. So as we take the Lord's Supper, let's take the time and test ourselves so that then God won't have to test us, and especially so that then evil won't take that opportunity to tempt us.